y'all, Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about how I would do things a little differently if I were to through hike the Appalachian Trail again. It's been over 3 years now since I started my through hike of the AT, and actually over 3 since I finished it also. But throughout my through hikes of the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail, and even here recently, just before finishing the CDT, Perk and I had conversations about, how would we have maybe changed things up if we had the knowledge that, we gained on those other 2 through hikes. And so I just wanted to share some of those thoughts with y'all today in case some of y'all are planning to either section or through hike on the Appalachian Trail. First things first, I probably would have started the trail a little bit earlier. I knew that in May I would have a graduation to go to for one of my siblings back home, so I would have to get off trail, travel home, go to the graduation and all the festivities, and then travel back. And in that time off, depending on how long you take off, you can kind of lose some of the progress you've made towards your trail legs. So if you know that you have any weddings or graduations or any kind of things that you've already committed to that you might have to go back home for, I would certainly plan to start a little earlier. Now, I actually did take that into consideration. I was thinking about starting maybe the first week of April or even the second week of April, but I started instead on March 29th on the approach trail. But I always recommend starting a little bit earlier anyway, just in case some sort of emergency happens or an injury. And in my case on the AT, not only did I get off trail for that graduation, but I also ended up having to get off trail when my dog Sugar got sick at home and ended up passing away. It was a whole big awful ordeal, and then I had plantar fasciitis also, which slowed me down, so I ended up not summiting Katahdin until October 19th when there was snow and ice everywhere. And although it was an epic finish, I would have liked to have not had the ending be so stressful, and not have to worry about finishing on time. So I think if especially you have something to do, starting even earlier than that is better. So if I had it to do again, I might start mid-March, knowing that I had some obligation and then also planning for emergencies, but at least a week earlier than I did. So if I'm talking about an earlier start date, I want to go ahead and transition into gear because I was a little bit cold in the Smoky Mountains. So if I started earlier, I probably would have been even colder at night. So with that earlier start date, and maybe even just because I freeze and I don't like being cold, I would probably go with a warmer sleeping bag. So I have the Sierra Designs 23 degree bag, but that rating is for basically survival, so you will live down to 23 degrees in that bag, but the comfort rating was probably more along the lines of 30 degrees, and when it dropped down to 30 or even in the upper 20s, I was pretty chilly. I would also probably go with a higher fill. I believe that sleeping bag was a 700 fill down, and the one that I have now is 800, so I like the loftier bag. So I would go with a colder rated bag with higher fill because I just like that fluffy loftiness. The reason I went with that sleeping bag is because it was a pretty good deal price-wise, and I was on a pretty strict budget. I had gotten all of my gear in a period of a couple months leading up to the through hike, so if you've got time to kind of spread out your gear purchases and upgrade slowly, you might not be as much in that situation. But when you start at the last minute and you're buying everything at once, then it hurts the budget a little bit more. And because I was trying to budget, I went with a closed cell foam sleeping pad, and by New Jersey I was absolutely miserable and I could not sleep. So if I had the glass ball to look into and know that that wasn't going to work for me, then I probably would have started with an inflatable sleeping pad. Again, it is a big price difference between the Neo Air Extra Light that is like my go-to sleeping pad now and the closed cell foam pad that I think I paid like 10 or 15 bucks for. For a pack, the Osprey that I started with was a good pack to start with. It carries well. For my heavier gear that I had at the time, it was probably a better pack, but knowing what I know now, and now that I've lightened up my base weight some, I think that a Dyneema pack or Cuban fiber pack would have been a really, really good choice for the Appalachian Trail because it is raining all the time out there. And on the Pacific Crest Trail and Continental Divide Trail, I didn't get as much rain as I did on the AT, but it was just so nice having that Cuban fiber as another barrier of waterproofing to protect my gear. So I had my Dyneema pack, and then I lined it with a compactor bag. I did the same on the AT in my Osprey pack, but those packs just soak up so much water. So on top of being miserable and soggy from being rained on, now you've got a lot of water weight that soaks into that pack and takes a little while to dry out. So if I could magically have the knowledge from the other trails and go back to the AT, or if I did it again, I would go with the Z-Packs Duplex, or at least some lighter tent. At the time, I did not feel comfortable with a tent that had to be put up using any kind of skill. It was my first backpacking trip ever, so everything was new. Even having my Big Agnes Fly Creek UL2 be a tent that doesn't completely stand up by itself, you have to stake out the rainfly, that made me a little bit nervous, but having something like the Duplex where I'm setting it up with trekking poles and all that, it would have freaked me out. So, but if I magically had that knowledge, I would go with that option on the Appalachian Trail, or I would now, because you just can't beat the weight savings. Now, I know that there are people who are concerned with condensation, and on a trail like the Appalachian Trail where it stays a lot more wet and damp in general, I guess it could be a concern, but I know there have been thru hikers who have successfully used the Z-Packs Duplex on the AT and they loved it. Something else that I wish I had tried on the AT in the rain is an umbrella. The only reason I ever started hiking with an umbrella was to protect myself from the sun when I was in the desert on the PCT, and then I fell in love with it. And later in the Cascades, I wish I had had an umbrella. And at the end of the CDT, I was really glad to have an umbrella when I was getting rained on and sleeted on and snowed on. So I wish that I had started the Appalachian Trail with an umbrella. I think just not the Reflectix deal that I used in the desert on the PCT or CDT, but just a cheap collapsible umbrella from like Walmart, just a lattice one that you can find. Just because I think saving yourself the mental annoyance with being just poured on and just being able to take a break under your umbrella and eat a snack if you want to, I just think it would be priceless. Now, when it did finally get colder in New Hampshire and in Maine, I do wish that I'd had a little bit better gear for the freezing cold rain and when it started snowing. I wish that I'd had a base layer to hike in, so I had my sleeping clothes that I would hike in if it wasn't raining and it was cold, but I do wish that I had another base layer to be a little bit warmer in while I'm hiking in the rain. In addition to that base layer, I think having the neoprene booties that I discovered on the CDT and the waterproof gloves, those blue Showa gloves, I think having those on the AT in New Hampshire and Maine would have been wonderful and would have just made things a lot more comfortable. And finally, I thought back then that hand warmers, carrying those on trail just seemed like a ridiculous weight. You use it one time and then you've got to tote the rest of that dead, useless weight all the way to town. But when I finally used some of those on the PCT and the CDT, I realized what a huge morale booster they are, and I think that they're definitely worth it when you're freezing. Like I said, hopefully if I redid it, I would have started sooner and I wouldn't really need this cold weather stuff. But I wish that when I found myself in that situation that I had added those things and had them sent out to me. The final piece of equipment that I hope that I would not need if I redid it, but that I should have used on the AT are micro spikes. I didn't even know what micro spikes were, and I climbed Katahdin in snowy, freezing cold, icy conditions. I think the high for that day was in the lower 20s. I think it was 21 when we summited Katahdin. And I was on thick ice, sliding around, didn't know what I was doing, but I got up there, I got down, was successful, but it would have been a really good idea to have some micro spikes. Let's talk about food and water now. First of all, I would not have carried as much food and water as I did starting out my first day on the AT. And that's something you just learn with time, because it's well, Dixie, how much is enough food and water? And I would just say that you're probably going to overpack on food, and that's okay. I mean, it's really your preference. Would you rather not pack enough and be hungry, or would you rather pack too much and think, I really shouldn't have packed too much and I can't even eat all this if I want to. So we pack our fears. So whatever you're afraid of, you will find yourself packing. And as you get more and more comfortable and more seasoned, you'll start to adjust some of those things. But I had 2 liters of water starting on the approach trail, and there is water everywhere on the Appalachian Trail. So after that first day, I never carried 2 liters again until a pretty dry stretch later in Pennsylvania. And that was the only time, because there really is so much water that if you're thirsty out there, you've somehow made a terrible mistake. If I did the AT again in regards to food, I would probably try to be a little healthier. I started off on a pretty good note on the AT. I had foods that I had dehydrated sent to myself, so some vegetables so I could throw into some ramen noodles or pasta sides. And I dehydrated ground beef to get some different protein in than just jerky and tuna and all of those things that eventually I was very sick of. So I would probably do more of that. And I talk about how I don't really like to mail myself resupply packages for things that I can buy in a store if I'm going through the town. You know, like, why buy something from the Walmart near me and mail it to myself in a town that has a Walmart, right? But some of those things that you can't get on trail, like some good dehydrated vegetables, then I would probably dehydrate more of those and try to send them to myself. I'd also attempt to avoid as many carbs, so just the straight junk food and sugar and powdered donuts and all that, and try to eat a little bit more protein. Again, this is difficult to do because towards the end of a thru hike, I find myself just not really wanting to eat anything that you can take backpacking as food. I find myself just wanting to eat from restaurants and to cook my own meals, you know, like in a normal kitchen. So towards the end, anything that I can look at and go, that's any sort of appetizing, I'll probably pack it out. But this is something that I'd like to work on as I hike more and more, is just trying to be a little bit healthier while I'm on trail. And I've thought about doing some videos on some of that, so if that's something y'all would be interested in, let me know. For water filtration, when I was on the AT, I started with the Sawyer Squeeze, but I was using the bags that come with it, the little bladders, and I honestly did not know that they had replacements for those. But I busted some of the bags, and I don't know, I just got tired of all the squeezing, and I didn't realize that you could just screw a Sawyer Squeeze onto a smart water bottle, collect dirty water, you know, in the smart water bottle, put it on, and then drink straight through it, because that just takes out that extra step. And it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, but when you are filtering all of the water that you use to drink, and I usually cook with filtered water too, that way I don't have to worry about, you know, boiling it for a certain amount of time, it really does add up. You know, you just take all of the minutes of the day that you do that, and it's like, it becomes kind of tedious. So I ended up with a platypus gravity filter, and I really did like that system for the AT because there's so many trees that you can just hang it up and let it do the work for you. But again, I didn't know how easy it was to put a Sawyer on a water bottle and just drink through it. So if I were to do it again, I would probably do the smart water bottle with the Sawyer Squeeze. If I was hiking with a group, so say I had a husband and children that I was hiking with, you know, then I might go with that platypus filter, just because it'd be easy to do, kind of like one stop, get everybody some clean water and move on. I know I have talked about this several times, but with footwear, I would definitely start the AT in trail runners instead of starting with boots like I did, because it ended up giving me tendonitis in my Achilles. The boots were the proper size, they weren't too small or anything like that, but a lot of times folks think that they need ankle support that they don't necessarily need. You know, if you're starting slow and you let your ankles build up and strengthen, you might find yourself not really needing that ankle support. So for me, that was a case, and it ended up actually hindering my progress and caused injury to my ankle. So I ended up transitioning to Solomon's, and then later on the PCT went to Ultras. So if I was to start the AT today, I would start them in Ultra trail runners. To add to that, I would also stretch more. And that is not to say that on the PCT and CDT I did a good job of stretching, but the Appalachian Trail is a much more physically intense trail than the other two. So there are times where you're doing some hand over hand climbing, and the uphills and the downhills and everything are just a lot steeper and more intense. So I would just try to do a good job of at least stretching the plantar fascia and my Achilles tendon and just all of that stuff in the feet and legs. All right, let's talk about navigation. So on the AT, I used AWOL's guidebook, and it's a wonderful resource. It has different mile markers to look for. It tells you what to expect at each shelter area and campsite, and access points into towns and the amenities in town. And it's a wonderful tool, but it's heavier than just having a cell phone. So if you have a smartphone, I would recommend getting the GutHook app, and you can even get AWOL's guide also on your phone as a PDF, or you can have AWOL's guidebook to have some sort of physical navigation in your hand, so you can, you know, look at it if your phone is dead, and then also have GutHook. But it's hard to say because I really did like having the paper to look at. But knowing what I know now, and after not having any physical paper maps or guides on the last two trails, I would likely get AWOL's PDFs for my phone, and then also get GutHook. It's just GutHook shows you exactly where you're at when you're there. So if you walk away from the trail, you can like navigate back to it. You know immediately whether you're on the right trail or not. You don't have to wait like a tenth of a mile to see if you reach some mile marker or some landmark, some water source or whatever on AWOL's guide to, wonder if you're in the right place or not. As far as some sort of emergency device, of all 3 of the thru hikes I've done, I feel like the AT is the one where you don't need until you need it, right? But a personal locator beacon or spot device or Garmin InReach, if I had to pick one that I would say you are the safest without those, it would be the Appalachian Trail. However, just for my family to have some peace of mind, I do wish that had been in my budget, because just to let them know, I'm okay. My brother was getting ready to go on a backpacking trip this week, and I was like, hey, why don't you take my InReach with you? I just worry about you. What if something happens? And he's like, I'm with 3 other people. You went and hiked the AT alone for your first backpacking trip. And how do you think we felt as your family, knowing you were going out there and didn't have something like this? And I was like, okay, fine, point taken. So just for that peace of mind for yourself and for your family, it really is priceless. I think some other general tips that I think it's important to remember. It's easy for me to say now what I would have done, because hindsight is 20/20, right? And I'm talking about, if I could go back, I would use all of this fancier, more expensive gear than what I did use. And that's simply because of comfort and convenience. That is not to say that if you're planning the AT and you were looking at my old gear list and you're like, but I was aiming to get some of that same stuff that you had before, and now you're saying like you would have rather had all of this nice, better gear. And the thing is, you don't have to have the most fancy, perfect gear to be successful at thru-hike in the Appalachian Trail. You just don't. My friend Rebel Yell, which I've mentioned several times, had a 100-liter pack, and all of his gear was not ridiculously heavy, but heavier than the average thru-hiker's base weight, probably. And he completed it just fine. So yes, going light can be easy on the joints, but you also have to look out for, are you going too light and now you don't have everything that you need and you're uncomfortable? So there is a fine line somewhere, and that is different for everybody. I'm sure if any of y'all have backpacking experience and you look back on your first trip, you probably have made some adjustments since then. You probably are like, yes, I would have done things differently, but that doesn't mean that your first trip was miserable or unsuccessful. But I have been asked the question, how would you change things? So these are some of the things that I would have changed or would have done differently or would do differently if I were to thru-hike the AT again. Anyway, that is all I have for y'all today. If you have questions about something specific that I did not mention in the video today, like, hey Dixie, would you still have done XYZ? Feel free to leave that in the comments and I will try to answer all of those questions. Or if any of y'all have thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail or section hiked it and you've made adjustments from that first go of it, I'd love to hear what some of those changes were, and those might also help other folks. But thank y'all so much for watching, and we will see y'all next time.